since I could hold my head up high. And it's been a while since I first saw you. And it's been a while since I could stand on my own 2 feet again. And it's been a while since I could call you. And everything I can remember is fucked up as it all may seem. The consequences that are rendered, I stretched myself beyond my means. And it's been a while since I could say that I wasn't addicted, and it's been a while since I couldn't say I love myself as well. And it's been a while since I've gone and fucked things up just like I always do. And it's been a while, but all that shit seems to disappear when I'm with you. And everything I can remember is fucked up as it all may seem. The consequences that I've rendered, I'm gonna fuck things up again, Why must I feel this way? Just make this go away. Just one more peaceful day. It's been a while since I could look at myself straight. And it's been a while since I said I'm sorry. And it's been a while since I've seen the way the candles light your face. And it's been a while, but I can still remember just the way you taste. And everything I can remember is fucked up as it all may seem to be. I know it's me. I cannot blame this on my father. He did the best he could for me. It's been a while since I could hold my head up high. And it's been a while since I said I'm sorry.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us here at Science of Addiction. I'm Risto. Many of us know addiction to be a chronic illness that alters the structure of the brain. But what actually happens inside the brain when drugs are being administered? What changes do you often see as a result? Here in this series, we're going to further explore the nature of addiction and how it affects the structure of the brain. Before we can understand the full sway of addiction, it would make sense for us to understand the primary areas of the brain that are affected by addiction. There are 3 main areas of the brain that you often find associated with addiction. The first one being the prefrontal cortex, the limbic system, and the midbrain. So the prefrontal cortex is responsible for all the executive functions in the brain, such as your decision-making processes, your logic, and your own reasoning. This often makes sense of our higher function when we decide whether or not something is a good or a bad idea. The limbic system is the reward circuit of the brain. This is responsible for remembering a lot of pleasant experiences and reminding us that perhaps we could do it again. For example, if you were to eat cake for the very first time, your limbic system would undoubtedly say that cake is such a lovely experience and we should eat cake again sometime. Finally, we have the midbrain. The midbrain is responsible for all of our survival functions, whether it's our vision, our hearing, or our flight and fight responses. The midbrain is responsible for the next 15 seconds, and does not view anything past that amount of time. So, when drugs and alcohol are first administered into the system, there's a large surge of a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Now, dopamine is primarily responsible for a lot of your cognitive functions, movement, and some senses of euphoria, but not to the scale of when you're actually using drugs or alcohol. When someone uses a psychoactive substance, it unleashes an inhuman amount of dopamine, something that you can never get from any natural experience. In fact, the brain even has a hard time comprehending how much dopamine is now in the system. It releases another neurotransmitter known as glutamate. Now, glutamate is responsible for your memory functions. The more glutamate that is in the system, the more likely you are to remember this experience and in greater detail. These neurotransmitters also affect the nature of the midbrain. When you have these many neurotransmitters going on, the midbrain becomes more and more sensitive to the needs of using drugs and alcohol. And these surges of neurotransmitters also affects the nature of the midbrain. The more glutamate and dopamine that's in the system increases the sensitivity of the midbrain to drugs or alcohol, making it a higher priority in the brain's functioning. Once drugs and alcohol are introduced into this pyramid at the base, the other higher levels begin to become less and less of a priority because all the focus of the brain is beginning to become more and more centered on the addiction itself. So this would explain a lot of the physical occurrences you see in your everyday life when people are addicted, that they don't often hold their social obligations at a high enough standard. Maybe people are becoming less social when they're addicted to drugs or alcohol, or they even not show up for work. So this begs the question, if drugs and alcohol can be so dangerous to the nature of the brain that it completely rewires it into a repeated pattern of use, why not just stop? Why doesn't the prefrontal cortex actually make the executive decision that drugs and alcohol are not good and we should cease using? If only it were that simple, though. See, the issue is that we have a highly overly stimulated midbrain, and the midbrain is closer to the spinal cord, which means that all the electrical signals are going to be triggering the midbrain first before the prefrontal cortex can make an executive decision. So before anyone even has the chance to even consider whether or not picking up another bottle of alcohol or taking another shot of heroin is a good choice, the midbrain is already activated and the limbic system is already going crazy, making it imperative that the drugs and alcohol are actually a necessity of life. Even if your executive functioning does not recognize it as such, your subconscious is already screaming, wanting you to re-administer the substance. So in essence, before you even have a chance to consider the choice of addiction, most of your brain has already made up its mind as to whether or not it wants to use. So with this understanding of addiction in mind, it further enforces the need for evidence-based treatment that keeps these considerations in mind before we can actually start creating real change in treatment. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something new. Please leave a comment down below or hit this nice subscribe button here, or even give us a thumbs up, and we would love to hear more from you.
Let me introduce myself. I'm an adjunct faculty member at the Phoenix campus and the professor in charge of the trauma program at Ottawa. I also am a licensed psychologist, and what I want to be talking about here is how to use the new DSM-5, particularly in relation to substance disorders because it's quite different than it used to be. Let me talk for a minute about DSM-5 in general. As you know, or maybe you don't know, all the axes have gone away. There is no multi-axial diagnosis anymore. So personality disorders and what used to be Axis 1 disorders are part of a diagnostic narrative description. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what else gets included in those. And then when I talk about substance use, we'll come back and look at how you might formulate a diagnosis. But what happens is that we don't have Axis 3 as a separate diagnosis. Medical conditions just become part of the narrative. We also don't have an Axis 4 for stressors anymore. Instead, what we have is 130 V and Z codes, which are things like experience to trauma, combat-related, domestic violence, other things that might be the stressors that are triggering the disorder. The other thing that we don't have is Axis 5. Now, substances are a little bit different than some other categories because they have a built-in severity index. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But there's also an instrument that's available both in the back of the DSM-5 and on a website. It's called the WHODAS, World Health Organization Disability Assessment Scale. And it's going to be used with all disorders because what it does is allow you to assess how disabled is this client because of their difficulties, and talks about several different areas: mobility, relationships with others, participation in social life. So it allows you to come up with a number that will show you the areas in which the client is disabled by their disorder. That's basically what we're going to have instead of the multi-axial diagnosis. You're going to want to log on to a website called Psychiatry Now because there are 80 clinical assessment instruments that can either be filled out by the client, by a parent, sometimes by a reporter, or by the clinician, so that they may have severity indexes for, say, psychotic behavior that the clinician fills out. They have what they call cross-cutting symptom measure, which just gives you an overall assessment of what kinds of symptoms the client is experiencing. Might be useful to do with substance disorders, just to make sure that there isn't something else that's going on at the same time. They also have specific assessments for things like PTSD, obsessive compulsive behaviors, depression, anxiety. The expectation is that you will do a level 1 cross-cutting assessment and then use some of the assessments in level 2 to give you a better idea of what might be going on with the client. So there's a pretty sophisticated set of assessment instruments. One of the nice things about them is they're very short. So they can be used, for example, as a session-by-session assessment of how is somebody's depression level, how's their anxiety level, how's their PTSD level since my last treatment with them. There's also a website that has a lot of assessment instruments for substance abuse. It's called Project CORK, C-O-R-K. Has the DAST, the MAST, the audit. Just useful to have them because one of the things that site does is give you all the research evidence related to those assessments and gives you both a sheet that you can have clients fill out and a scoring key for the assessment. So it's a good source of other assessment information for substances. Let me talk now, though, about how the DSM-5 differs and how it treats substance use. The main thing is they have done away with the differentiation between substance use, substance abuse, and substance dependence. There is one category now, and it's called substance use. It's diagnosed for every medication. For example, you might have one for prescription painkillers, one for methamphetamine, one for alcohol, and it will be alcohol use disorder. And it's defined in terms of problematical patterns of use. And it has 11 criteria. One of the best ways you can use these is to copy them and just for each client make a checklist of which of the criteria fit that client, because there's a built-in severity scale in substance use disorders. And I'll talk about that in a minute. To take the example of alcohol, and this is pretty much the same format as all of the other substances, you're going to have clinically significant impairment or distress as manifested by at least two of the following. And there are 11 criteria. Alcohol is often taken in larger amounts or over a longer period than was intended. For example, you go into the bar, you think you're going to have one drink, and you drink yourself under the table. There's a persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control alcohol use. For example, the person may say, yeah, I'm going to quit drinking. May be able to do it for a week, 2 weeks, and then goes back to the substance use. A great deal of time is spent in activities necessary to obtain alcohol, use alcohol, or recover from its effects. So if a person has hangovers on a regular basis, spends all evening, every evening in a bar, then that would certainly qualify for this criteria. Craving or a strong desire or urge to use alcohol. Recurrent alcohol use resulting in a failure to fulfill major role obligations at work, school, or home. Client doesn't make it to work on Mondays because they're hungover. They promise to be available for their kid's soccer game and don't make it because they're drunk. Continued alcohol use despite having persistent or recurrent social or interpersonal problems caused by or exacerbated by the effects of alcohol. So husband and wife get into arguments almost every day over someone's drinking. Important social, occupational, or recreational activities are given up or reduced because of alcohol use. So the person may have really enjoyed camping with the family and gradually quits doing any camping because they'd rather stay home and drink. Recurrent alcohol use in situations in which it's physically hazardous. Obviously, drunk driving is one of those situations. Alcohol use is continued despite knowledge of having a persistent or recurrent physical or psychological problem that's likely to have been caused or exacerbated by alcohol. For example, the doctor says your liver is showing signs of a problem and you really need to stop drinking, and the person continues to drink heavily despite what the doctor has said. We do still have tolerance and withdrawal as one of the criteria. Tolerance is defined by either of the following: a need for markedly increased amounts of alcohol to achieve intoxication or desired effect, a markedly diminished effect with continued use of the same amount of alcohol. Withdrawal as manifested by either of the following: the characteristic withdrawal syndrome for alcohol or closely related substance such as benzodiazepine is taken to relieve or avoid withdrawal symptoms. The severity of the disorder depends on how many of these criteria fit. So if you have 2 or 3 of them, it's mild, probably corresponding to the alcohol use disorder in the DSM-4. If you have 4 or 5, it's moderate, and if you have 6 or more, it's considered severe. They also have diagnoses for alcohol intoxication and alcohol withdrawal. So for example, if you're doing a clinical intake and the person is clearly intoxicated, then you would add that to the diagnostic picture. Or if the person is beginning to experience symptoms of alcohol withdrawal, that would be another diagnosis that would accompany the alcohol use disorder. So what you're doing is basically counting the symptoms. How many of these does this client exhibit? That's why it's useful to actually copy the criteria, and they're virtually the same for all of the substances, and just make a checklist. Okay, how many of these does this client fit? How many of these does this next client fit? Which is going to help you to make an assessment of mild, moderate, or severe substance use. So in some ways, it's got the criteria built in. One of the things that's a little bit challenging about the DSM-5 is that every substance has its own diagnosis. So you're going to diagnose alcohol use disorder, cannabis use disorder, methamphetamine use disorder, if you have somebody who has polysubstance problems. The diagnosis might go something like 45-year-old male with severe alcohol use disorder, combat related, which is the V code, and has disabilities in interacting with other people and communication. So the diagnosis is going to be more in paragraph form than in outline form. I hope this has been helpful for looking at how to diagnose alcohol use disorders, and I hope you will get onto psychiatry now and look at the assessments, because I think the expectation is going to be that you will use some of those assessments to check and see if there are other related problems. For example, you have somebody who's a Vietnam veteran who has chronic PTSD, alcohol use disorder. That would be kind of a picture of that client. So poke around the DSM-5. You'll get familiar with it and be able to use it in all of your diagnostic work.
Can you imagine a pleasure so intense that you would be willing to give up everything you care for, your family, your friends, your health, your freedom, just to temporarily experience it? I certainly could not. Yet this was the way that the behavior of addicts was explained to me when I was a medical student, and the way it's still explained by many in the healthcare system. A perspective that has helped promote the notion of addiction as moral failure. But it's more incomprehensible than that, because my addicted patients could not understand it either. They said that the drug was no longer even pleasurable, and yet they could not stop taking it. And this loss of control over one's own behavior intrigued me so much that I've been trying to understand how this would happen. But where do you start? By then, we already knew from animal experiments that all of the drugs that produce addiction increase dopamine in the brain reward regions, activating them. However, what happens in the transition from being able to occasionally enjoy a drug into the compulsive administration of addiction was a complete mystery. I was very lucky that as I was finishing medical school, a new technology had emerged, positron emission tomography, that enabled us for the first time to image the living human brain. To me, as a young scientist, this was like science fiction, because it provided me with a tool that I could use to compare the function and biochemistry of the brain of a person that was addicted to drugs from that of someone who was not. And this image here illustrates our first findings, initially reported in cocaine abusers, that we went then to replicate in methamphetamine abusers, alcoholics, heroin abusers. And what we found was that the brain of addicted individuals had a reduction in the levels of dopamine D2 receptors. Dopamine D2 receptors regulate the function of the frontal areas of our brain that allow us to exert self-control, thus providing an explanation about why an addicted person would be more vulnerable to impulsive and compulsive drug administration. These findings made me start to wonder whether something similar could be happening in obesity. Because after all, most obese individuals want to lose weight, but they cannot control their food intake. So the same question: can you imagine food being so pleasurable that you are willing to forgo 10 years of your life because of the adverse health consequences from obesity, or undergo the stigma from the disapprovals cast by others because you cannot hide obesity? I certainly cannot think of such a food. Thus, we apply the same methodology to investigate morbidly obese individuals. And what we found was that just as for addiction, their brains had a reduction in the levels of dopamine D2 receptors, indicating to us that this was a biochemical signature of a brain where the capacity to control strong urges has been compromised. But why? Why? Why would this happen? Our brains are hardwired to respond to rewards, which then motivates our actions. Reward is a brilliant solution to ensure that we will do behaviors that are indispensable for the survival of the individual and of the species. Because after all, if food or sex were not rewarding, we would not eat or procreate. And dopamine is the chemical that signals reward in our brains. Interestingly, dopamine is increased not just by rewarding pleasurable stimuli, but also by stimuli that predict a reward, which we call conditioned stimuli. And again, this is a brilliant solution, because when you increase dopamine in your brain, that enhances the motivation and sustains the drive for you to do the behaviors that are necessary to procure the reward, therefore ensuring that you will go and get the food so you can eat it. For example, this great-looking chocolate, the visual of this great-looking chocolate is making me want to eat it now. And if I had it now, I would eat it. My brain is conditioned to chocolate, so that mere visual is making my brain predict that it's going to get a reward. And dopamine is going up in my brain just by visually observing that stimuli, which then makes me want to eat it. Most of the time, I'm actually able to resist that urge of wanting to eat that chocolate. Sometimes I fail and I feel very guilty later. And I find myself that I'm much more vulnerable to failing and to not be able to resist the temptation when I'm hungry. And the hungrier I am, the worse it gets. But this makes sense. When my brain is hungry, and particularly if I am starving, my brain gets into a state that I like to call of deprivation. In the state of deprivation, the main priority of my brain is to find the food so I can eat it. Because for most of human evolution, food was scarce and hard to come by. So you want to ensure that you would pay attention so that you would do the behaviors so that you could eat, because otherwise you may not survive. However, in our current environments where food is everywhere, this has become a liability. And in fact, I find myself constantly, actively having to suppress the urge to eat all of this extraordinary-looking food that is everywhere. Food stimuli are everywhere. Visuals, auditory, smell. And when I eat the food, when I cannot resist it, I eventually feel satiated. And when I'm satiated, the food stops being rewarding to my brain, which then, of course, enables me to change my behaviors and to do things that in the past may have had an advantage over my survival later. However, our modern societies have engineered highly rewarding food that can bypass that satiety mechanisms. These are foods that are rich in sugar, fat, and salt. And these are foods that can trigger compulsive overeating in almost every one of us. These foods are the ones that can create havoc in the brain dopamine reward system. Highly rewarding food, just like drugs, produce sharp and short-lasting increases in dopamine, and the repeated and frequent administration progressively leads to a loss of dopamine D2 receptors, which then compromises our ability to control the strong urges to eat this very appealing food. Obesity, just like addiction, represent extreme consequences of the disruption of the systems in our brain that enable us to balance between immediate rewards that enable us to take care of immediate needs, and behaviors that may have an advantage later once those immediate needs have been accomplished. Addiction and obesity have been stigmatized and dismissed as disorders of poor self-control, self-inflicted, personal behavioral choices. Personal behavioral choices. You know, I've never, ever met an addicted person who wanted to be an addict, nor have I ever met an obese person who wanted to be obese. Their dismissal are just problems of self-control. Can you imagine what it must be to want to stop doing something and not be able to do it? And you try, and you fail, and you try again, and you fail again, and again, and you start hating yourself for not being able to do it. I don't need to imagine. I can remember. My grandfather took his own life at his inability to control his alcoholism. One final and last relapse, and he surrendered to self-hatred. Or my obese adolescent patient who contemplated suicide to escape the relentless and cruel bullying from her peers. Dismissal of addiction and obesity as just problems of self-control ignores the fact that for us to be able to exert self-control, we require the proper function of the areas in our brains that regulate our behaviors. In simple terms, and taken to the extreme, it's like driving a car without brakes. No matter how much you want to stop, you will not be able to do it. Some of us, because of our genetics, our developmental trajectories, our social circumstances, are more vulnerable to these disorders than others. And though we don't know yet how to remediate the genetic and developmental vulnerability factors, we already have the tools to address the problem of obesity and of addiction. Because for the most part, obesity and addiction can be prevented. The current problems that we're facing of obesity are not the result of mutations in our genes, but of the dramatic changes in our environment that have occurred over the past decades. We, humans, excel at our ability to change environments. So why can we not re-engineer them so that instead of making us vulnerable, they strengthen our biology? We know how to prevent obesity. We've done it in the past in small communities. The challenge is not knowing how to do it. The challenge is in committing the resources now to create an infrastructure that provides with options and alternatives. But real options and real alternatives. Why can we not have food that is healthy, appealing, accessible, and affordable? Why can we not generate environments that promote rather than hinder physical activities? The challenge is in committing the resources now to build an infrastructure that will provide with real alternative and real choices for everyone, not just those that can afford it. Some will argue that creating such an infrastructure will be costly now. One can counter-argue that this will be more than offset by all of the savings from averted medical costs, plus the economical growth of a new food industry. So can we all imagine committing now for something that will provide us a much greater social benefit later? I certainly can. It makes sense. Not only will we save lots of money from averted medical consequences, but we will improve the health of all of us and that of the future generations. Thanks.
We all know when it comes to gambling, the house always wins. I was cashing my paychecks, taking it there, starting to borrow from banks, starting to borrow from loan sharks.
But the dirty little secret is just how much government-run casinos rely on problem gamblers.
15% to 50% of gambling revenue comes from problem gamblers.
There's no doubt that they exploit addicted gamblers. It's their stock and trade.
Governments say they promote responsible gambling, but do they really?
Who has a problem with responsibility? It's a good thing. But it is also a concerted public relations campaign.
They need to come up with a way to ensure that this is not going to happen to other people. What happened to me?
On this edition of The Fifth Estate, we go undercover to investigate the government's addiction problem. And Terrence McKenna enters a Dominican jail to visit a Canadian businessman locked away just after he appeared on The Fifth Estate.
And there's no money in the world that's worth what I've had to live through.
When it comes to gambling, Canadians have plenty of skin in the game. Last year, we spent about $13 billion on legal, government-run gambling. It's estimated we spend another $12 billion or so every year on gambling websites and illegal bookmakers. Imagine that, about $25 billion a year. That's 3 times more than we spend on movies, hockey tickets, and Tim Hortons combined.
What fun is waiting at OLG Slots and Casinos?
Hey Canada, could it be we have a gambling problem? Well, not if you watch casino ads on TV, like these ones for Ontario's Lottery and Gaming Corporation.
Good luck charms, wow.
Here, the only gamblers they portray are good, wholesome people.
I got a hat that I wear on poker, and just figure it brings me luck.
I always have to walk in on my right foot.
And gambling? Good, wholesome fun.
I just keep this in my hand. I keep hoping it brings me luck. I say, come on, you can do it for me.
You don't see people like Joe Frieri in their ads, but you sure see them in their casinos. Pushing buttons, staring at screens, hour after hour after hour. Like hundreds of thousands of Canadians, Joe is a gambling addict.
How much money do you think you've lost gambling?
I had estimated a short time ago, I would say anywhere between $2 and $3 million.
And how much money do you owe today?
Probably about, between family, about 1.5 million.
Between family, loan sharks, bookmakers?
Yes, correct.
That's a deep hole, Joe.
Yeah, yeah.
And it all started so harmlessly. Joe's childhood defined by family, church, school, and sports.
I innocently liked to play cards when, we'd get together as family and play on Christmas, and we'd play cards for a few hours to pass the time.
As Joe grew older, the stakes grew higher. He was soon gambling every day, and the casinos wanted his business, sending him promotional flyers and coupons, urging him to keep coming back.
At what point was it when you realized that you had crossed that line? And
probably
you were
in
now...
early to mid-20s, because I'd already at that point had received a few bailouts from my family.
Joe's weakness? Electronic gaming machines, or EGMs, like slots and video poker. Seems everyone loves them. Governments certainly do. OLG says 88% of casino gaming revenue comes from slot machines. To put their popularity in perspective, there are some 100,000 legal EGMs in Canada. That's compared to 65,000 ATMs. Author and academic Natasha Schul says these machines have a corrosive effect on all gamblers, not just addicts, designed with sophisticated algorithms to separate you from your money.
What I found, I actually find more sinister, which is that people are not trying to create addicts, they're trying to increase revenue. And a kind of collateral damage is that they create addicts.
Success is measured not only by revenue, but by the time gamblers spend on these machines. It's known as TOD, or time on device, where gamblers are lulled into a trance-like escape from life and loss.
I kept hearing this word, I'm in the zone, I go into the machine zone. And the machine zone they described was a kind of state that's outside of time and outside of space, where monetary value falls away. You're just in a flow. You lose track of even yourself.
But surely it's only addicts who end up in the zone, right? Well, I came to the Gambling Research Lab at the University of Waterloo to find out. Kevin Harrigan leads a team examining the physiological rush gamblers get.
These have to go on. Should be fairly snug, but
yeah,
I don't want you to lose.
I'm wired up to measure my heart rate, sweat level, and the pressure from my trigger finger as I play.
So how does that feel?
That was perfect.
Okay.
I start with 1,000 credits on the machine.
What are the odds of me winning in this game?
The odds of you winning something are really good. About half the time or a third of the time you're going to win something.
I would have thought the odds would have been lower.
But hold on, there's a catch to all those so-called wins.
Yeah, well, what happens is that a lot of those wins, about half of them, are actually losses. So you're wagering, let's say, 20 cents, and you're winning 8 cents. So you have a loss of 12 cents, but it flashes and makes sounds as if you've won.
So it's a loss disguised as a win.
Correct.
And as long as my body interprets that I'm winning, I keep playing?
Yep.
As my heart rate increases, I learn even the illusion of winning gives players a blast of dopamine, like a chemical jackpot for the brain.
Okay, so now here you have one of these losses disguised as wins.
So I'm closer to a win, but I'm still losing.
Yep.
I'm feeling like a winner. If I didn't see what my credits were,
right.
Am I up or am I down? I would tell you I'm way up.
Like one gambler said, if I keep on winning, I'm going to go broke.
Unlike card games or horse races, bets on a slot machine come fast and furiously. According to Harrigan, the industry average is about 1,000 spins an hour. Studies suggest the rapid-fire gambling increases the onset of addiction.
And there is something mesmerizing about this.
Gamblers may see these as games of chance, but insiders say they've been designed to reduce the chance of winning the longer gamblers play.
So you win, the casino wins and the house wins on two fronts, is that they've taken all my money that I put into this machine.
Right.
And they've increased the likelihood that I'm going to come back and do it again.
Correct.
Some compare these machines to crack cocaine, others to cigarettes, both highly addictive by design.
I heard one game designer talk about the math that he was designing, and he was drawing some graphs for me. He's like, this is what an old slot machine looked like. Big valleys and peaks, spiked, really spiky. This is what our new machines look like. And he drew this slow curve. He said, we want people to recline on our algorithms the way you recline on a comfortable couch.
But the line is eventually heading down.
It's all about slowly eroding, nibbling away at your budget until you reach zero. So this is discussed as giving gamblers a smoother ride, a ride to where? A ride to zero. A ride on that graph down to the moment when you can't play anymore, which is often called the moment of extinction.
Joe knew he was past the point of extinction. His gambling debts were slowly killing him.
You need to be protected from yourself.
Sometimes, yes. In this case, I did. In this case, I couldn't do it on my own anymore, as I was trying.
Joe had an idea. He could ban himself from the casinos. It's a program called self-exclusion, common at casinos across Canada. Ontario's casinos now have facial recognition software. This company video shows how it's supposed to keep banned gamblers out.
Once they are isolated and identified via the cameras at the fixed entrances, for example, the alerts are sent to the operator, at which time the operator can make an informed decision on the self-excluded individual as to next steps.
But does this high-tech security system really work? As we'll show you, we went undercover to find out.
The story doesn't end here. Like the Fifth Estate's Facebook page so you can follow our investigations. We will post updates on stories and special video features that take you deep inside.
Ontario's appetite for legalized gambling had pretty humble beginnings.
Welcome back to Ontario. Tonight we're coming to you live from Queen's University in Kingston. Tonight live from Warsaw. From the Etobicoke Olympian.
It began in 1975 with a single lottery called Wintario, with spinning balls and televised draws. The lottery made a meager $43 million profit in its first year of operation, but that was then.
Thrilling games, delicious food, and
This is now. Today, the gleaming OLG is the biggest provincial gaming corporation in Canada, with more than 18,000 employees, generating $7.5 billion in gross revenues for a deficit-ridden government. But ever wonder who is anteing up that cash?
So today we're talking about the portion of gambling revenue derived from problem gamblers.
Robert Williams is a professor at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta. He's an expert in gambling research.
Depending on the jurisdiction and the time period, between 15 to 50% of gambling revenue comes from problem gamblers.
By his calculation, addicts pump billions a year into government-run casinos across Canada.
If your revenue base is hinged on drawing a good portion of your money from an addicted population, that's a problematic business enterprise if you're just in private business, let alone government.
Consider this. In 2016, the Alberta government made more money from gambling than it did from oil and gas revenues, because this is a business that's all boom, no bust. In the past 20 years, gaming revenues in Canada have quadrupled, much of it pure profit for governments. Joe Frieri says the OLG made a pretty profit from him. He says he spent about $1 million at OLG casinos and insists no one on staff ever suggested he stop playing or get help.
It's an addiction that's very quiet. Mm-hmm. In other words, you'll never know if somebody has a gambling problem. Mm-hmm. And the province needs to know that. And they need to come up with a way to ensure that this is not going to happen to other people. What happened to me?
What percentage of your clientele would you define as a problem gambler?
So the research suggests that between 8 and 12% of a player base might have some kind of issue. So we need to support people.
Paul Pellizzari doesn't deny problem gamblers are a problem for the casinos. He's the OLG's executive director for policy and social responsibility.
Do you want problem gamblers in your casinos?
We do not want problem gamblers in our casinos, and here's the reason why, Mark. For the most part, Ontario is a locals market. It's different from Las Vegas, it's different from Macau. We need people who can play today, tomorrow, next year, and 5 years from now.
So this is where you're showcasing the machines or testing the machines?
Yeah, we test them, we help develop.
So how do you keep them playing safely? Make sure they don't reach that moment of extinction. Pellizzari shows me how the OLG is giving players the option to limit the amount of time and money they spend on slots. It's kind of like a casino nanny cam.
But for all the information that's provided here,
yes,
I am free to ignore it.
It's, again, informed decision-making, internally building for players internal self-controls. That over the long term is what leads to healthier play.
The OLG spends about $50 million a year on problem gamblers for research, awareness, and treatment. Joe benefited from that program. He received gambling counseling paid for by the OLG. He also signed an agreement with OLG to voluntarily ban himself from their casinos. They call the program self-exclusion. But Joe says none of that stopped him from playing whenever he got the itch.
I was still self-excluded, and I went back, walked into Woodbine, and I just started all over again. You know, I was cashing my paychecks, taking it there. Starting to borrow from banks, starting to borrow from loan sharks again.
But you're on the self-exclusion list.
I still am, yeah. Yeah.
And nobody is stopping you?
Nobody's stopping me.
Nothing?
Nothing.
Pellizzari says the OLG has built a better firewall to keep self-excluders out, spending $500,000 on facial recognition software.
And if they are detected?
If they are detected, then a staff member very discreetly goes over, talks to the person, probably pulls them away from the gaming floor, determines that they are who we think that they are in terms of the self-exclusion program, and then we discreetly remove them from the property.
So, does the high-tech detection system really work? Well, we decided to put it to the test. Our producer, Scott Anderson, put himself on the self-exclusion list. OLG took his picture and his personal information. A week later, we sent him out on a mission. Could he walk into an OLG casino and play? Or would the state-of-the-art cameras catch him? First attempt, the slots at Flamborough Downs.
How you doing? Good, you? Good, thanks.
He walks past the security guard and the cameras and into the casino. He plays the slots, then cashes out and exits. Well, maybe it was beginner's luck. So we make a second attempt an hour later, the slots at Mohawk Racetrack.
How are you?
Once again, he gets a polite welcome, then sits down and plays. He decides to push his luck and heads to Casino Niagara. New location, same warm welcome, and no one stops him from playing. Shortly after, we make a fourth and final attempt across town at Fallsview Casino. Well, it's four of a kind. Our so-called self-excluded gambler has beaten the house time and time again.
Jackpot!
And then he went to see what would happen when he showed up at your properties, and this is what happened.
We showed the video to Paul Pellizzari.
How do you explain why our producer got into 4 different properties and was never detected?
We provide supports to detect self-excluders.
But you have facial recognition.
No one element of the program is designed to be foolproof.
But 4 out of 4?
We detect over 3,000 people every year. We've improved that number. It is one support that we provide. We're going to look at how we can improve it. But the important point is to not characterize it as a policing program, because that's a disservice to gamblers.
Author Natasha Schul says self-policing isn't an addict's strong suit. That's the weakness, she says, of responsible gambling programs.
But it is also a concerted public relations campaign that deflects attention away from problematic products and industries and puts it all on the person. You manage yourself.
So, is there a better way to weed out self-excluded gamblers? Well, why not simply ask them to show ID at the door?
Most countries in the world, you got to show any government ID to get in a casino. There's no long lineups. In fact, you can automate it by just scanning it. You know, Disneyland does that with thumbprints. There's lots of automated ways to have a more reliable detection system. It's just North American casinos have been reluctant to do it.
They're choosing not to do it.
They're choosing not to do it. I think it's a fair characterization.
But there is one policy the OLG enforces rigorously. If you're self-excluded and you win big, you're out of luck. So gamblers on the banned list are free to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars in the casino. But the minute they win a jackpot of more than $10,000, casino reps won't pay them out. No, they'll kick them out of the casino. So how often does this happen? Well, according to information obtained by the Fifth Estate, it's a growing problem. Over a 6-year period, there were 274 cases of self-excluded gamblers who were caught when they won big jackpots. Last year alone, there were 77 new cases. That's a 28% increase.
But you understand the optics here. That if I'm self-excluded, I can give you thousands and thousands of dollars, which you will freely take. But the minute I ask for my winnings back, you're saying, no, sorry.
They've made a commitment to themselves to stay away from the property. They know that it's on them to not come back to the casino, and that these things are in place to remove them.
OLG has settled at least 18 cases out of court, paying off the problem gamblers, who then sign an agreement to ensure everyone keeps quiet about it. Sean Dewart has taken on more than a dozen of these cases.
I mean, now everyone who participates in the self-exclusion program learns pretty early on that it's a joke, and that this piece of paper they've signed means absolutely nothing, and they are free to go back in and indulge in their addictive behavior.
Do you think OLG knows that this is a toothless policy?
There's no doubt in my mind that OLG knows this is a toothless policy. Because OLG hasn't really done anything to give it any teeth.
Pellizzari won't explain why the OLG settles with the problem gamblers.
I can confirm that there have been lawsuits in multiple jurisdictions, including Ontario. We're obliged to respect confidentiality in these matters.
Dewart has a simple, albeit cynical, explanation about why OLG settles.
For one thing, they frequently get the money back, which is to say that there's a settlement that ends up in my client's pocket, and my clients do what all addicts do, which is they go right back into a casino. So in some cases, I'm quite sure OLG is cognizant of the fact that the money's just going to go in a circle.
And the circle of publicity keeps spinning, like the numbers on the slot machines.
No, sweetie!
Last year, the OLG spent $333 million on marketing and promotion, urging gamblers to come early and come often.
I love this guy!
We're leaving in 5 minutes, okay?
3 more. 3 more? 3 more.
Such a fun age, isn't it?
Across Canada, governments, it's estimated, spend close to $500 million a year promoting gambling with ads like these, while at the same time banning ads for smoking and drinking.
The only thing missing is you. We're all play.
As for Joe, whether you sympathize with him or not, don't tell him fun wins every time. He's more than $1 million in debt, and the loan sharks are circling.
Do you fear for your life? No?
I do, yeah. Every day I do. But it's just something I have to deal with.
How are you going to get out of that hole?
I don't know. I'm just fighting now I'm basically fighting just to try to make ends meet. It's never enough. And it always puts me back in the thinking of maybe I can go back to gambling to win, to have that big score, to help me with this at least.
But what really angers him is after pumping $3 million into legal and illegal slot machines, his life is hanging by a thread, and the casinos continue to profit on addicts like him.
You know what, I might not be able to save myself in the end, but I just want to save somebody who, you know what, as a teenager could wander into these places or get, manipulated. So I just want to save somebody, and I know I can. I know I can. I know I have the ability through this channel, this media, to save somebody out there.
I hope you can, Joe.
Thanks.
Thank you.
One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I was just a little kid, so I didn't really understand why. But as I got older, I realized we had drug addiction in my family, including later cocaine addiction. And I've been thinking about it a lot lately, partly because it's now exactly 100 years since drugs were first banned in the United States and Britain, and we then imposed that on the rest of the world. It's a century since we made this really fateful decision to take addicts and punish them and make them suffer because we believed that would deter them, it would give them an incentive to stop. And a few years ago, I was looking at some of the addicts in my life who I love and trying to figure out if there was some way to help them. And I realized there were loads of incredibly basic questions I just didn't know the answer to. Like, what really causes addiction? Why do we carry on with this approach that doesn't seem to be working? And is there a better way out there that we could try instead? So I read loads of stuff about it, and I couldn't really find the answers I was looking for. So I thought, okay, I'll go and sit with different people around the world who've lived this and studied this and talk to them and see if I can learn from them. And I didn't realize I would end up going over 30,000 miles at the start, but I ended up going and meeting loads of different people, from a transgender crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, to a scientist who spends a lot of time feeding hallucinogens to mongooses to see if they like them. It turns out they do, but only in very specific circumstances. To the only country that's ever decriminalized all drugs, from cannabis to crack, Portugal. And the thing I realized that really blew my mind is almost everything we think we know about addiction is wrong. And if we start to absorb the new evidence about addiction, I think we're going to have to change a lot more than our drug policies. But let's start with what we think we know, what I thought I know, right? Let's think about this middle row here, right? Imagine all of you, for 20 days now, went off and used heroin 3 times a day. Some of you look a little bit more enthusiastic than others at this prospect. Don't worry, it's just a thought experiment. Imagine you did that, right? What would happen? Now, we have a story about what would happen that we've been told for a century. We think because there are chemical hooks in heroin, as you took it for a while, your body would become dependent on those hooks, you'd start to physically need them, and at the end of those 20 days, you'd all be heroin addicts, right? That's what I thought. First thing that alerted me to the fact something not right with this story is when it was explained to me, if I step out of this TED Talk today and I get hit by a car and I break my hip, I'll be taken to hospital and I'll be given loads of diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's actually much better heroin than you're ever going to buy on the streets, because the stuff you buy from a drug dealer is contaminated, actually very little of it is heroin, whereas the stuff you get from the doctor is medically pure. And you'll be given it for quite a long period of time. There are loads of people in this room who may not realize that you've taken quite a lot of heroin, right? And anyone watching this anywhere in the world, this is happening. And if what we believe about addiction is right, those people are exposed to all those chemical hooks. What should happen? They should become addicts. This has been studied really carefully. It doesn't happen. You will have noticed if your grandmother had a hip replacement, she didn't come out as a junkie. And when I learned this, it just seemed so weird to me, so contrary to everything I'd been told, everything I thought I knew. I just thought it couldn't be right. Until I went and met a man called Bruce Alexander, who's a professor of psychology in Vancouver, who carried out an incredible experiment that I think really helps us to understand this issue. Professor Alexander explained to me, the idea of addiction we've all got in our heads, that story, comes partly from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. You can do them tonight when you go home if you feel a little bit sadistic. You get a rat and you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself quite quickly. So there you go, right? That's how we think it works. In the 70s, Professor Alexander comes along and he looks at this experiment and he noticed something. He said, we're putting the rat in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do except use these drugs. Let's try something a bit different. So Professor Alexander built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats, right? They've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of colored balls, they've got loads of tunnels. Crucially, they've got loads of friends, they can have loads of sex, and they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They almost never use it. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. You go from almost 100% overdose when they're isolated to 0% overdose when they have happy and connected lives. Now, when he first saw this, Professor Alexander thought, maybe this is just a thing about rats. They're quite different to us, maybe not as different as we'd like, but, But fortunately, there was a human experiment into the exact same principle happening at the exact same time. It was called the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, 20% of all American troops were using loads of heroin. And if you look at the news reports from the time, they were really worried because they thought, my God, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States when the war ends. It made total sense. Now, those soldiers who were using loads of heroin were followed home. The Archives of General Psychiatry did a really detailed study, and what happened to them? It turns out they didn't go to rehab. They didn't go into withdrawal. 95% of them just stopped. Now, if you believe the story about chemical hooks, that makes absolutely no sense. But Professor Alexander began to think there might be a different story about addiction. He said, what if addiction isn't about your chemical hooks? What if addiction is about your cage? What if addiction is an adaptation to your environment? Looking at this, there was another professor called Peter Cohen in the Netherlands who said, maybe we shouldn't even call it addiction. Maybe we should call it bonding. Human beings have a natural and innate need to bond. And when we're happy and healthy, we'll bond and connect with each other. But if you can't do that because you're traumatized or isolated or beaten down by life, you will bond with something that will give you some sense of relief. Now, that might be gambling, that might be pornography, that might be cocaine, that might be cannabis, but you will bond and connect with something because that's our nature. That's what we want as human beings. And I think, at first I found this quite a difficult thing to get my head around, but one way that helped me to think about it is, and I can see, I've got over by my seat there a bottle of water, right? I'm looking at lots of you, and lots of you have bottles of water with you, right? Forget drugs, forget the drug war. Totally legally, all of those bottles of water could be bottles of vodka, right? We could all be getting drunk, I might after this. But we're not, right? Now, because you've been able to afford the approximately £1 gazillion that it costs to get into a TED Talk, I'm guessing you guys could afford to be drinking vodka for the next 6 months. You wouldn't end up homeless. You're not going to do that. And the reason you're not going to do that is not because anyone's stopping you. It's because you've got bonds and connections that you want to be present for. You've got work you love. You've got people you love. You've got healthy relationships. And a core part of addiction, I came to think, and I believe the evidence suggests, is about not being able to bear to be present in your life. Now, this has really significant implications. The most obvious implications are for the war on drugs, right? In Arizona, I went out with a group of women who were made to wear T-shirts saying I was a drug addict and go out on chain gangs and dig graves while members of the public could jeer at them. And when those women get out of prison, they're going to have criminal records that mean they'll never work in the legal economy again. Now, that's a very extreme example, obviously, in the case of the chain gang, but actually almost everywhere in the world we treat addicts to some degree like that. We punish them, we shame them, we give them criminal records, we put barriers between them reconnecting. There was a doctor in Canada, Dr. Gabor Mate, an amazing man, who said to me, if you wanted to design a system that would make addiction worse, you would design that system. Now, there's a place that decided to do the exact opposite, and I went there to see how it worked. In the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is kind of mind-blowing. And every year, they tried the American way more and more. They punished people and stigmatized them and shamed them more. And every year, the problem got worse. And one day, the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and basically said, look, we can't go on with a country where we're having ever more people becoming heroin addicts. Let's set up a panel of scientists and doctors to figure out what would genuinely solve the problem. And they set up a panel led by an amazing man called Dr. João Goulão to look at all this new evidence. And they came back and they said, decriminalize all drugs, from cannabis to crack. But, and this is the crucial next step, take all the money we used to spend on cutting addicts off, on disconnecting them, and spend it instead on reconnecting them with the society. And that's not, essentially, that's not really what we think of. What they did wasn't really what we think of as drug treatment in the United States and Britain. So they do residential rehab, they do psychological therapy that does have some value. But the biggest thing they did was the complete opposite of what we do. A massive program of job creation for addicts and microloans for addicts to set up small businesses. So say you used to be a mechanic. When you're ready, they go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. The goal was to make sure that every addict in Portugal had something to get out of bed for in the morning. And when I went and met the addicts in Portugal, it's fascinating. What they said is, as they rediscovered purpose, they rediscovered bonds and relationships with the wider society. It'll be 15 years this year since that experiment began, and the results are in. Injecting drug use is down in Portugal, according to the British Journal of Criminology, by 50%, 50%. Overdose is massively down. HIV is massively down among addicts. Addiction in every study is significantly down. One of the ways you know it's worked so well is that almost nobody in Portugal wants to go back to the old system. Now, that's the kind of political implications. I actually think there's a layer of implications to all this research below that. You know, we live in a culture where people feel really increasingly vulnerable to all sorts of addictions, whether it's to their smartphones or to shopping or to eating. You know, before these talks began, you guys know this, that we were told we weren't allowed to have our smartphones on. And I have to say, a lot of you looked an awful lot like addicts who were being told their dealer was going to be unavailable for the next couple of hours. And, you know, a lot of us feel like that. And it might sound weird to say, oh, you know, I've been talking about how disconnection is a major driver of addiction. But weird to say it's growing because you think, well, we're the most connected society there's ever been, surely. But I increasingly began to think that the connection we have, the connections we have, we think we have, are like a kind of parody of human connection. If you have a crisis in your life, you'll notice something. It won't be your Twitter followers who come to sit with you. It won't be your Facebook friends who help you turn it round. It'll be your flesh and blood friends who you have deep and nuanced and textured face-to-face relationships with. And I think there's a study I learned about from Bill McKibben, the environmental writer, I think tells us a lot about this. It looked at the number of close friends the average American believes they can call on in a crisis. That number has been declining steadily since the 1950s. The amount of floor space an individual has in their home has been steadily increasing. And I think that's like a metaphor for the choice we've made as a culture, right? We've traded floor space for friends, we've traded stuff for connections, and the result is that we are one of the loneliest societies there has ever been. And yet, Bruce Alexander, the guy who did the Rat Park experiment, says, we talk all the time in addiction about individual recovery, and it's right to talk about that, but we need to talk much more about social recovery. Something's gone wrong with us, not just as individuals, but as a group. And we've created a society where, for a lot of us, life looks a whole lot more like that isolated cage and a whole lot less like Rat Park. But if I'm honest, this isn't why I went into it, right? I didn't go in to discover the political stuff, the social stuff. I wanted to know how to help the people I love. And when I came back from this long journey and I'd learned all this, I looked at the addicts in my life, and if you're really candid, it's hard loving an addict, and there's going to be lots of people who know in this room you're angry a lot of the time. And I think one of the reasons why this debate is so charged is because it runs through the heart of each of us, right? Everyone has a bit of them that looks at an addict and thinks, I wish someone would just stop you. And the kind of script we're told for how to deal with the addicts in our life is typified by, I think, by the reality show Intervention. If you guys haven't seen it, I think everything in our lives is typified by reality TV, but that's another TED Talk. If you've never seen the show Intervention, it's a pretty simple premise. You get an addict, all the people in their life, gather them together and say, if you don't shape up, confront them with what they're doing, and they say, if you don't shape up, we're going to cut you off, right? So what they do is they take the connection to the addict and they threaten it. They make it contingent on the addict behaving the way they want. And I began to see why that approach doesn't work. And I began to think that almost that's like the importing of the logic of the drug war into our private lives. So I was thinking, well, how can I be Portuguese, right? And what I try to do now, and I can't tell you I do it consistently, and I can't tell you it's easy, is to say to the addicts in my life that I want to deepen the connection with them, to say to them, I love you whether you're using or you're not. I love you whatever state you're in, and if you need me, I'll come and sit with you, because I love you and I don't want you to be alone or to feel alone. And I think the core of that message, you're not alone, we love you, has to be at every level of how we respond to addicts, socially, politically, and individually. For 100 years now, we've been singing war songs about addicts. I think all along we should have been singing love songs to them, because the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Thank you.
What's just lying around shit? Well, what the hell we supposed to do, you moron?
War's over, man. Wormer dropped the big one.
What? Over? Did you say over? Nothing is over until we decide it is. Was it over when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor? Hell no!
Germans? Forget it, he's rolling.
And it ain't over now. Because when the going gets tough, the tough get going. Who's with me? Let's go! Come on!